What is rehab or rehabilitation? My name is Fred Begaris, a board-certified sports and spine medicine physician in Virginia Beach, Virginia. After 10 years of practice, I still find musculoskeletal medicine both fascinating and challenging. This podcast is about the lingering thoughts and questions I've had after residency and fellowship. My hope is to spark discussion, challenge dogma, and share my experiences in musculoskeletal medicine. Welcome to the Talking Rehab Podcast. Even before medical school, I was always interested in the mechanics of how people get injured. I first discovered this when I was taking a sports medicine course in high school, and I got a chance to work with the athletes and be on the sidelines, and I would watch how they moved. And that's when I started developing these questions about how come certain people get hurt. And I noticed that people would run and jump and throw differently. And it made me wonder if there was a quote unquote correct way to do these movements. And if you move correctly, does that decrease your chance of injury? So naturally, this kind of landed me into the realm of biomechanics, kinematics, and kinetics. But for the purposes of today's episode, I'm going to just kind of use biomechanics as the main term, in addition to movement, because there is definitely a difference, but that's outside of the scope of this episode. But I did want to give a little bit of a disclaimer that I'm going to use a term just to simplify things, even though that there are distinctions between these other ones. Earlier in my career, I really liked the study of movement through biomechanics because it was science-based, it made sense, there was cool drawings, you could measure the movements, and it was kind of a good framework to understand healthy movement, injured movement. And as I started to get more experience, once I actually started practicing, I started off very dogmatic about this is why you get hurt, because if you look at the way you stand up or look at your heel strike, this is exactly the problem. And I was able to help a lot of people making some of these suggestions about why their mechanics are quote unquote off or wrong, and they would get better. So I would get a little bit of feedback and say, well, I made this suggestion and they changed their mechanics and their symptoms got better. So naturally, I was like, well, maybe this translates all the way up and down the body. But the more experience I got, I started noticing that changing some of these, movements and mechanics don't always result in the outcome I assumed, which is decreased injury, decreased pain, improved performance. Now, that's not across the board, but I started to become less rigid with that type of ideology. But on top of that, I started wondering, what does my view of biomechanics, what is that really based on? And so I'm going to go through some of the assumptions that I have about biomechanics and movement. It may not be complete, and I'm sure there certainly can be some discussion around it, but these assumptions are what really kind of started to free me from being so rigid when I started questioning them. So the first one is that when you approach things from a biomechanical standpoint, there is an assumption that everybody moves the same way. Assuming you're born with 2 arms and 2 legs and you're able to walk, your mechanics present in a certain way, and anything outside of that norm is quote unquote abnormal. But when you look at these studies they obviously target the people that they're studying. So these people are usually athletes, or sometimes they're, let's say they're later in age and they have underlying issues. These populations, let's assume this is like a young, healthy college type population. It selects for a certain type of body and certain type of movement and athlete. So assuming that everyone moves correctly and you base this off of numbers of these athletes, it doesn't really account for the non-athletic person, different heights, different femur lengths, even handedness. Some people may be right-handed, but they kick with their left. So some of these little nuances actually do make a difference, because the fact that it is based off the assumption that everyone moves one way, I think is flawed. As a sports medicine physician, I do think that when we look at the biomechanical lens, it's from a pathologic lens. There's something wrong versus like, that's just how they move. It's very rare for me to run across a clinician that comes to that conclusion. Like, we tend to medicalize or pathologize, not sure if that's a word, the way that things move and the way and why people hurt. And again, the biomechanical model from a therapeutic standpoint makes that assumption that everybody moves a certain way, and if you move outside of that norm, then that might be the potential cause. That leads me into the next reason that there is a quote-unquote right way. So as a child, I grew up playing baseball, basketball, all the typical sports. So when I got into residency, I got really into looking at the biomechanics of throwing and swinging, jumping and running. And you look at these books and you see the forces that go through the joint. You start to appreciate which angles produce the most amount of force. And maybe if you just follow this particular pattern of movement, that's essentially the right way. And it just really is not that. It's just not true, in terms of if you just make everybody move like the book says people should move, that leads to decrease of pain, no injury, things like that. And maybe it doesn't necessarily lead to performance. There's certainly plenty of studies that show that, making small tweaks to improve the numbers might achieve the goal of improving the numbers, but not actually improving performance or decreasing pain. And a lot of this also comes down to the coaching. I am a movement specialist. I like to watch people move just as much as the next person, but I think that sometimes with coaching, we can get a little bit too focused on you're dropping your elbow or you need to rotate more, because on some level, if you've ever worked in sports medicine, you've heard of people tweaking something to make things look more, correct, quote unquote, and it resulted in pain in different areas. So like while the pitch might be faster, they now are experiencing hip pain because of the tweak that you did. And so that in and of itself, kind of told me, I was like, well, maybe there's not a right way. It's just really more individualistic that, should we really be studying the way that person likes to move versus telling them that they are moving incorrectly? I mean, sure, there are some tweaks to try and improve their performance, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way that person's body tends to move or likes to move. That leads me to the next assumption, that there are certain mechanics that definitively lead to injury or lead to prevention of injury. And I was a big believer in this, that if you just, kept 90-90 when you're doing or don't go past 90 when you're doing squats, or as long as you get enough hip rotation, then this won't be a problem. With social media, you start to see that people move the way that they move and they can get outstanding results in terms of performance. I've seen people, do crazy squats with their legs essentially knock-kneed, and they are doing fine. I've seen people perform these crazy physical feats, and it just does not make sense how that doesn't hurt, and yet they are doing it. And the only way that I can kind of explain that to myself is that this person has obviously trained in a way that allows that particular movement to occur, and they've developed the mechanics to support it. Now, we still have parts, tendons, ligaments, joints, cartilage. Those things do not violate physics. I do believe that if you do things in a certain way, the tissue can get damaged or give way. But again, that's really looking at it from one very focused perspective. Again, using the person doing a crazy movement They have developed their own personal mechanics to support not only the movement, but also to support the tissue so that they do not get actually injured. I don't think it's as easy as it sounds. We can measure things kinematically with cameras and do all sorts of motion analysis, but at the end of the day, I think there's some general provisions on movement and mechanics, but a lot of them just don't hold up across the population. You can always find these exceptions, but at some point you start to see a ton of exceptions to the rule. And what that tells me is maybe we are missing some of the picture here, that even though the numbers say that this is the best, why are these other folks outside of those numbers unable to perform, or they're not getting injured compared to the folks that are within that range? Another assumption is that, again, mechanics don't change with time and age. And from, a physics standpoint, that doesn't change. But in terms of movement and the parts that you have, do your biomechanics when you're 12 years old look the same when you're 60? And we're not talking necessarily about pain or throwing a baseball. Just in general, like when you move when you're 12, does that look exactly the same when you're 60? And there are a lot of external factors that play into that. Not only the biological piece and sporting piece, but the life piece. We're not typically driving when we're 12 years old, so we tend to run and move a lot more. Conversely, when we're 60, 70 years old, we tend to be less active, and we have changes to how much our joints actually bend and straighten out. And that, I think, has to be accounted for, because for what's good for one point in time doesn't necessarily mean that strategy, that movement strategy, works at every point in time. Then there's what I call corrective or prescriptive mechanics. As an example, let's say we have someone throwing a baseball and we see a change. We see something that we can modify in their pitching mechanics that will hopefully improve something, right? That can be, pitch velocity, it can be accuracy, it can be pain. And sometimes you can make those changes and we assume that only one consequence is going to happen. Let's say it's pain. You have a pitcher with elbow pain, you make a tweak, and it improves their elbow pain. But when you tweak one part of the system, you're tweaking everything else too. And so sometimes there are unintended consequences. So while they no longer have elbow pain, they may have wrist pain. They might have shoulder pain. And so you're going to continue to tweak the rest of the system all the way down? Maybe those tweaks to the wrist and the shoulder are actually kind of normal when you're trying to change mechanics affecting a painful elbow. But it's hard to convince a competitive pitcher that, hey, this shoulder pain and this wrist pain is normal as we're making changes. That can be, unless you have a very deep understanding of the rehabilitation process and how mechanics take time to normalize. That can be very hard as a coach to, tell their parents that, like, hey, this is normal. So it doesn't necessarily account for the unintended consequences of changing someone's mechanics. I mean, you might get the result, but you may also get something else. Kind of a corollary is this idea of corrective or prescriptive biomechanics. It assumes that normalizing the numbers of the movement translates to all tasks. Let's say you have someone that can run, jump, swim. You measured all of their mechanics and it is perfect. Now, does having normal numbers translate to all tasks? And it doesn't. If you're having someone throw a fastball versus a slider versus a curveball, their mechanics are going to change. And they do change outside of the quote-unquote normal. So we have to appreciate that we need different mechanics depending on the task we're trying to accomplish. And again, the tasks need to be defined as performance, rehabilitation, injury prevention, or just decreasing symptoms altogether. But is your task defined? Even if it is defined, the mechanics are likely going to be different depending on the task, and that can get really very, kind of gives you a big headache when you have to think about, well, how many tasks am I trying to accomplish, and I have to work on all these biomechanics to achieve those goals. It's much easier for us to assume that, well, if I have good biomechanics in all of these different movements, then it should translate across all tasks, and that's just not simply true. Just because you have good mechanics throwing a fastball doesn't mean you have good mechanics throwing a curveball. My last issue with the whole biomechanics discussion is surrounding the ideas of injury and performance. This is a big reason why people like to study biomechanics, is for these two reasons. Performance, resulting in, from a competition stance, faster times, wins, things like that, and from an injury and injury prevention standpoint. In my mind, being able to perform doesn't necessarily mean you have great mechanics, and being able to perform doesn't mean that you don't get injured. And I know that this is just my opinion, but what I see on social media and when I hear other people talk is a lot of people rest really, very heavily on the biomechanics lens or biomechanics view. If you work on your mechanics to become less injured, then your performance actually improve, and it just simply doesn't work that way. They don't live on the same spectrum. I point that out is that if, let's assume that you are performing really, really well, right? And as a result, you end up getting played more. So there's a volume of work issue that can sometimes lead to an injury. So then naturally what ends up happening is that you have someone who's a great pitcher, they have an injury, and rather than conclude that this is a volume related issue, we start looking at their mechanics. And so conversely, if you are a terrible pitcher, the chances of you throwing a lot is significantly less. Therefore, you're not as likely to get injured. Now, they might have perfect mechanics. Let's say they have perfect mechanics, but they just don't throw as fast as the next guy. They don't get played as much. Therefore, they don't get injured as much. So it's kind of a slippery slope when we talk about injury and performance, because they get used so interchangeably. We believe that they are, if you improve performance, you improve mechanics, then injuries don't happen. And the fact is it just doesn't pan out that way all the time. And I think as a clinical community, we would be better served kind of looking past some of these assumptions and start taking on different lenses as we try to help our patients and our athletes. I hope that this was helpful to you guys. At least from a residency standpoint, biomechanics was part of our training, but it wasn't a huge part. So I did a lot of supplemental learning on the side. And I hope that you guys find this to be very helpful. The physicians or physiatrists out there, I really encourage you guys to dive deep into it. It can be kind of dense, but definitely give that effort when you're studying, but also be cautious when you're watching social media stuff, because it can be super convincing, but just be very objective. Try to identify the assumptions, find ways to check your own bias, and continue to watch movement. Thanks again, you guys. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Talking Rehab Podcast. I hope that this podcast stimulates you to question your own practice and how you approach rehabilitation. I truly appreciate your time and attention. If you enjoyed listening, make sure to like and subscribe to the podcast. I wish you a movement-filled day. Take care.